Excellent. Let's depart. Dear colleagues and guests, thank you for joining us. My name is Armen Mazmanyan. I'm currently a visiting professor at Sant'Anna School for Advanced Studies here in Pisa. And on behalf of the school, I'm very happy to welcome you here to this seminar within the STALS, Sant'Anna Legal Studies Seminar Series. And today we have a distinguished speaker. I'm sure Professor Wojciech Sadurski doesn't need any introduction in this room. He is a world-leading scholar in constitutional theory who has authored many very influential books on constitutional and legal theory, human rights, not least also on democratization and constitutionalism in Eastern Europe and his native Poland. And now today we are hosting his presentation, his first ever presentation of the new book on populism or populisms, a topic which never becomes less topical at least in the last decade. And as some may think that the pandemic of the COVID, which was kind of battling the world in the last few years, is left behind. Probably this is not so true about the pandemic of the populisms, which, at least judging from the very important elections, very recent elections, at least in Hungary and France, we can say that populisms are still a virus that maybe the world will need to cope with for quite some time yet. But I do not want to enter into these waters before we listen to Professor Sadurski's presentation on his new book. Professor, congratulations on the expected release. The book is forthcoming with the Cambridge University Press, and we will have the chance to see and read it very soon. Professor Sadurski, the floor is yours.
Very much. Thank you very much, Arman, to you and to Professor Giuseppe Martinico for inviting me. Thank you to Sant'Anna Legal Studies Department. It is a great pleasure and honor. Now, before I move on, I just want to make sure that my PowerPoint is on and running. No, that's what I was afraid of. Let me go back. You can see my screen. We've tried it, we rehearsed it, and as always, I've done something wrong. Okay. No. Okay, can now and
yes,
slideshow.
We have the
view. Can you, Armen? Can you confirm?
Yes, we can see it, and
okay. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm very excited. This is the very first preview, in fact, of my book ever. This book will be out, as I was told, on the 14th of July. So if you are interested, and this is my little salesman's pitch to you, I'm very happy to send you, if you send me a note to my address, I'm very happy to send you a flyer with a discount offer of 20% on paperback. So it will be really very inexpensive. And may I recommend that you have a look at that book. If anything, because it has a truly beautiful cover and a beautiful title, which I must acknowledge was authored by Martin Krieger, who is my very dear friend and also member of the audience. So A Pandemic of Populists, with its striking alliteration, is Martin's contribution, as are his numerous comments on my earlier drafts. The first thing I want to say is a general caveat about this presentation. I've been thinking a lot about how to structure it, whether to focus on one particular issue and go in depth, or rather present a very, very superficial, by necessity, overview of almost everything. And I have decided on the latter course. That is, I thought that maybe it would be more interesting for me to tell you what the book is about rather than to go deeply into any particular argument. But since we will have some time, at least some of you, I hope, will be present also after my presentation, which should take no more than 40 minutes, I'll be happy to go into any particular issue that you may be intrigued by or interested in. So my big apologies for superficiality and this sort of an overview of the themes. Now, the first question I'm asking here is, why would anyone reach out for yet another book of populism? The academic field and the trade book field is quite crowded. We have had a great number of important and very good books on populism lately. We had a book by Giuseppe Martinico at the end of last year. We had only this year 2 new books, one by Bugaric and Tashnet, another by Jean Cohen and Andrew Arato. A little bit earlier, we had some great books by Takis Papas, by Nadia Urbinati, by Jan Werner Müller. What would be the reason of writing another book and hoping that the readers will reach out for it? So the 3 reasons I may offer is that A, I quite unashamedly and clearly adopt a view or understanding of populism, which is not necessarily the orthodox or the dominant view. I adopt what I call an institutional rather than discursive view of what populism is and why populism is worth studying. The second is that I'm quite clear in using populisms, just as Armen did in his introduction, in plural, and I try to explain the variety of populisms and what they are function of. And finally, I believe that the fact that the book is being published right now in mid-2022, well, has some added value because it takes on some recent developments which had not been necessarily registered by previous books of other colleagues on the issue. So let me start with the first point, this institutional approach. Now, what we have in the field is a dominance of what may be called a narrative or discourse-oriented approach, where populism is studied as a particular type of discourse, namely anti-pluralist discourse. And that approach is largely colored by the first important book in this recent spate. Of course, it wasn't the first book on populism, but in the recent trend of writing on populism, arguably the most influential was a small book by Jan Werner Müller, who sort of offered this type of discourse-oriented approach, where populism is characterized by certain normative orthodox discourse, which is fundamentally anti-pluralist. And in my book, I offer some reasons, at least for us, for constitutional scholars, rather than political philosophers, of not adopting that discourse. For one thing, I think that this narrative approach is over-inclusive. There are many unimpeachably democratic leaders who use the discourse of a special insight into the common good, which is good for everyone rather than pluralistically defined. On the other hand, it may be under inclusive because there are some populist leaders who do not often use that type of narrative that Müller and his followers attribute to populism. But perhaps the most important thing is that as a constitutional and institutional scholar, I'm much more interested in what populists do rather than what they say. So although there is a special chapter in my book on populist rhetoric, which I will mention a little bit later, I'm really mostly interested in institutional approach. So I define negatively populism, or more specifically, authoritarian populism as some sort of hybrid regime between fully fledged consolidated democracy and fully fledged authoritarianism. And the most important aspect of this hybrid that the populist authoritarianism or authoritarian populism, if you prefer, is that it derives its legitimacy from free and fair elections. That's the most important aspect of populism, which fundamentally distinguishes it from authoritarianisms or despotism, as John Keel calls it. That is that there had been free and fair elections at the beginning of the at least first cycle of populist rule. That does not necessarily continue into the second cycle. And if you look, for example, at the Hungarian deformations of electoral system, we'll see that, as we have seen it in the third consecutive victory of Orban, that was partly or largely due to a comprehensive suite of electoral deformation through changing, and in this slide I sort of provide an overview of at least 4 fundamental devices that Orban brought in order to skew the playing field to his favor. In particular, number 2, gerrymandering, and number 3, so-called replacement of the electorate, something on which most people here are quite aware. But going back to the starting point, at least in the first round of populist rule, their electoral legitimacy is rather unquestionable. Other aspects of this authoritarian populism, which in turn distinguish it from what may be called full or consolidated democracies, are that it is based on charismatic leadership, but charismatic not in a conventional sense of the word as some sort of, I don't know, flamboyant type of leader, but leader who has created a situation in which he or she, actually it's almost always he, indispensable, and where are basically no regular ways of replacing him. All power is concentrated in one hand, regardless of what are the constitutional rules. The system is anti-institutional in the sense which I will describe in a moment. And it is also characterized by the use of law in a discriminatory fashion, mainly against the opponents of the regime. And finally, there is this narrative aspect, that is the dominant narrative is based on various aspects of paranoia, not in a clinical sense, of course, but in the sense that Hofstadter used to talk about paranoid style in American politics, and in particular conspiracy theories. So my exemplars, even though the book is not structured on a case by case, but rather I'm referring to those various countries as it suits me or suits my argument, my main exemplars of this authoritarian populism in power, as opposed to populism that only attempts to gain power, like in the case of Le Pen, or currently maybe Mr. Salvini in this country. The exemplars of authoritarian populism in power for me are Hungary, Poland, India, the Philippines, with a small question mark, because we do not know whether President Marcos Jr. will more or less follow the style and politics of Duterte, and Brazil under Bolsonaro, and Venezuela, but historically, only until under Chavez rule, because Maduro has pushed it very much into the what may be called fully fledged authoritarian. So these are countries which I'm using as my examples of this sort of authoritarian populism that I have in mind. That's the first part, my institutional approach. The second reason, the second part of my pitch is that I'm trying to make it very clear that I'm seeing contemporary populism as a sort of oversimplifying word for a variety of phenomena. So we should be talking about populisms in plural. And here I'm using a paraphrase of a too often quoted first line of Anna Karenina: happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I paraphrase it into accomplished democracies are all alike. Every imperfect democracy is imperfect in its own way. Of course, there is some simplification in it, but I think that as a rhetorical trick, it will do. And my suggestion is that when we look around the world and look at various countries which are at least conventionally dubbed or characterized as populist, we may identify different types of factors which led to emergence and success of populism. And these factors are not necessarily replicated in the same intensity and configuration in different countries. So the 6 which I list here on this slide, and this I must emphasize is not a necessarily exhaustive list, are the sense of status anxiety and economic insecurity. Secondly, xenophobia and dislike, hatred, contempt towards the others, especially towards refugees. Disenchantment with incumbent political elite, so the anti-elitism. Resentment to globalization and internationalization, which result in the export of jobs to countries with lower labor costs and import of cheap commodities into one's market. Anti-modernism, that is some sort of countercultural type of resentment, anti-secular, anti-enlightenment, anti-egalitarian. And finally, impatience with liberal constraints upon constitutional government, which render the governance slow and ineffective. And now, some of these, of course, categories are mutually connected, others are not. And I suggest that it's a little bit like with Lego toys. The number of different Lego pieces is not infinite, and yet you may create different toys putting together in different ways, different pieces. And that's also the case of different populism. So that, for example, Trump's populism probably mainly had its sources in numbers 4 and 2. Well, in Polish or Hungarian populism, I think that this anti-globalization or anti-internationalism aspect was relatively low, but it was mainly, and similarly, the question of status anxiety in countries which are relatively successful economically, was of relatively low level, and yet certainly it was anti-modernist, anti-liberal, and xenophobic. So the success of populists in power is derived from a successful combination of more than one, of several of these types of anxieties, of frustration, and putting them into one and offering a simple answer to solving these real problems, but these real problems are different in different countries. And finally, the third pitch, or the third ground for my pitch for this book today is that it provides, I hope, an updated picture of contemporary populism. By the way, let me just say as an aside, I intended this book to be addressed to the general audience, so I can envisage that many of the sophisticated scholars and intellectuals who are present in this room will be greatly disappointed by the shallowness of the analysis. But that was sort of my aspiration. Going back to the point, I can identify at least 3 main reasons why my book may be seen as bringing some added value due to its topicality. First of all, because many of the populisms which I describe in my book have become consolidated. In the political science, consolidation science, that is those which survived more than 2 consecutive cycles of re-election, or at least one, or at least are in the second consecutive cycle. Poland, Hungary, India under Modi, not yet Brazil under Bolsonaro. I mean, these are consolidated populists. They managed successfully to get re-elected. And this consolidation has some very important consequences, other than just mere, chronological endurance. That means that illiberal institutions became entrenched, that the democratic institutional memories sort of fade away. New generations come into their active political life knowing only that system. The opposition becomes demoralized. They think, well, is it worth staying all the time in the backbenches? Perhaps better to be co-opted by the ruling party. So there are all sorts of psychological and political ways of living with the regime without necessarily loving it. The second point is, of course, COVID. So there is a chapter on the pandemic and its putative effects upon populism, to which I will return later in this presentation. And finally, I'm asking a question, maybe Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or maybe better, aggression against Ukraine, maybe also throws some light on the worldwide competition between populism and liberal democracy. Even though my book was in principle written before the invasion, before 24th February, nevertheless, I believe, and I make some points to it in the introduction, which I had redrafted after the invasion, maybe we can think of some consequences of the invasion. Obviously, one obvious consequence was that the 2 main exemplars of European authoritarian populism, Poland and Hungary, found themselves on 2 different sides of the political barricade when it comes to Putin's war. And that is an important factor. But I'm thinking more about the sort of conceptualization of the war offered by President Biden and also by EU decision makers such as Vera Jourova and others, that this war is a war which is an episode in the ongoing competition between liberal democracy, to which Ukraine aspired, after all, and authoritarian systems. And if so, then then my analysis of authoritarian populism has a consequence to it, because then we may ask ourselves openly a question, on which side of that divide both Poland and Hungary are? And I'm happy to come back to this issue later on. Now, let me say something about institutional aspect, because this is the main criterion for me of identifying a system as authoritarian populist. And here I rely very much on very important work by Martin Krieger on institutionalism and anti-institutionalism. And I ask my question, are really populist authoritarians anti or pro-institutionalist? For the simple, and the question makes sense because as we see it around the world, in the countries at least which I had just mentioned, the incumbent institutions, the institutions inherited by populists from their predecessors, are basically maintained. They largely stay intact. So in my book, I offer a taxonomy of various ways of hollowing out of the institution, because it's one of the most sort of popular metaphor for describing what authoritarian populists do with institutions. But it is just that, a metaphor, which requires some unpacking. And I unpack it by offering a list of at least 5, there are more, but these are the most important ways in which populist authoritarians hollow the institutions out, sort of deprive of their original raison d'etre, and often term them or convert them in a way that they serve different, often opposite purposes to those for which they had been set up in the first place. So the most obvious way is capture. Simply put your own people, put your own judges into the constitutional tribunal, and you don't need to do much more. That's what happened in Poland, where after 2016, when the government kept coming with all sorts of ideas about how to restructure the tribunal, once they have managed through natural attrition, but also through some dirty tricks to place all their people, all their supporters into the tribunal, they left it alone, because they already knew that the tribunal is captured. The second method is duplication. You create parallel institutions to those which exist, somehow overtake those original ones. That's, for example, the case of Hungarian Budget Commission in the parliament. That's the case of Media Board in Poland. The third one is erosion. You maintain the institutions, but deprive them of the powers and of the budget. That's, for instance, the case of, that's what Duterte did to the Human Rights Commission in the Philippines, where in one of his more eccentric outbursts of anger, he proposed and managed to confirm a budget, an annual budget for Human Rights Commission of $25, not 2,500 or 1,000, $25 a year. The next one is a migration. You maintain the institution, but place it in a different institutional context, which completely changes its standards of dependence. That's what happened to ombudsman. There are 3 ombudspersons, so ombudsman in Hungary, one of which was placed into the Ministry of Justice. That's what happened to the prosecutors, public prosecutor's office, which was integrated into the, again, Ministry of Justice in Poland. Finally, there are the issues of internal restructuring. You restructure the institution in such a way that it starts serving the ruling party's purposes. Moving on, the most important type of institutional battle, at least from my point of view, that authoritarian populists undertake are courts, both constitutional courts and regular courts. And that is because, as I call it in the title, which of course is a paraphrase of famous book by Alexander Bickel, that they are the least resilient branch, the most vulnerable, in other words. But at the same time, they are the most dangerous for authoritarian populists because they are a branch which, as I say in my first bullet point, offers an alternative sources of legitimacy. I mean, the whole strength of courts is that they do not rely on electoral legitimacy or legitimacy from the support by the population, but from a combination of professionalism and impartiality. That's what courts are expected to do, and that's where they derive their authority and their claim to our compliance. And for authoritarians, no other source of legitimacy, whether it's judicial or expert scholarly legitimacy or whatever else, is tolerable, because the only source of legitimacy which they boast is electoral legitimacy, that they represent the will of sovereign. And therefore, authoritarians, the first, and if you look at all the countries which I listed here, the first and the most obvious target of their institutional assaults are courts, where they exist constitutional courts, but courts in general. And there are many different ways of assaulting them. They may be hostile takeovers, as I call it. That is simply you place your own people in the court and that's it. There may be court packing. You reorganize, especially the number of judges, that you very easily obtain the majority. That was the case of Hungarian way. Or you restructure the courts in a completely different way. That's what Chavez did with their tribunal when he came to power. And it's interesting, and I'm also looking in my book on what are the responses of judges to that? What are the strategies available to them and taken by them? So one strategy would be open judicial resistance, sort of open defiance and protest. And that's what many judges in Poland do. And on the other side, there may be a certain passive resignation. That's what I think happened in Hungary. That's what happened in India with the Supreme Court in India. This sort of lying low strategy, which in India they had already quite successfully practiced in the Indira Gandhi's emergency rule, and which they now replicate under Prime Minister Modi. And the extreme, courts become willful, and I should emphasize, useful, helpful enablers for the executive rule. That is, the executive could do without them, but they are helpful in the sense that they lower the cost of political transactions by authoritarian rulers. They somehow pave the way to certain decisions which they could do otherwise. Like, I'm thinking about the National Judiciary Council in Poland, which could have been abolished by the legislative majority without more, because they have been doing worse things, but which was sort of replaced ostensibly as a result of a particular judgment of the new constitutional tribunal headed by Julia Przyłębska. And so it became somehow easier, and it happens often. Actually, there is a very interesting article by two Israeli scholars about judicial populism in Israel. So this is the case of actually judicial populism. But one thing, so it helps. So in that sense, constitutional courts and other courts which are captured help the rulers, but it doesn't come without cost. And the cost which I discuss is that in this case, the rulers lose an opportunity of playing the blame game. Blame game is a popular strategy in democratic states where certain so-called difficult or unpopular decisions are dumped on the court, right? So that the legislative majority may be seen to be virtuous. Unfortunately, their hands are tied because the court wouldn't allow them to do so. That often happens in the United States and other democracies. But you can't do it if the court is fully captured and if the society and also the external public opinion knows about it. You simply cannot play this blame game because the court is no longer an independent agent. And perhaps the most, if you like, spectacular symbol of this fact was that when the fully captured and more or less sham Constitutional Tribunal in Poland in October 2020 took its draconic anti-abortion decision, which was much later published only in 2021, the angry crowds, mainly women, but not only, went to demonstrate not outside the headquarters of the Constitutional Tribunal, but outside the residence of the de facto leader of Poland, Jarosław Kaczyński, because that's where the power lies. Then there is, of course, because I'm interested in constitutions, a chapter on constitutions in my book. So let me only say that, we can, on the one hand, identify those rulers which were, quote unquote, lucky enough that they had constitutional majority and managed to replace the old liberal constitution, as in Hungary and in Venezuela. And these two constitutions, even though one is coming from a very right-wing and another from very left-wing perspective, have some very distinctive common features, which I describe in my book. But more often than not, when the legislative majority or the executive power does not have that type super majority necessary for constitutional change, they simply proceed by obvious, vulgar breaches, violations of the Constitution, something that my friend and colleague Tarun Haitan constitutional scholar from India, calls constitutional shamelessness. He calls Modi constitutionally shameless and gives many reasons for it. And of course, that type of invective can be addressed against people like Kaczynski or Bolsonaro. So what I'm saying also in this chapter on constitutions is something that I called literal democracy, with T rather than B. And that is that what often populists and their acolytes and their ideologues and their lawyers do is to take a constitution as if it consisted only of the text, as there was nothing beyond the text in the constitution. So if something is left unsaid, then they say this is a constitution-free zone and anything goes. That's exactly what they kept doing in Poland, and they described many examples, say about the right of mercy by the president, but more importantly about the National Council of Judiciary, where certain things were left unsaid, not because the constitution makers had no view about it, because they were taken for granted based on the preceding conventions and customs. Now the populists say, well, the president can do whatever he wants and the legislative majority can do whatever they want because the constitution is silent on something. So there is no aspect of accumulated meanings, unwritten norms, and constitutional conventions visible to populism. Thank you, Armen. I will finish in 10 minutes. So now I will really run very fast because I want to move to the last item, which is probably the most important. So let me just say very briefly, I won't be developing this issue about populist narratives, which are largely based on paranoia, conspiracy, and lies. Examples of conspiracy theories are given on the right-hand side. Soros, obviously, the main target of Orban's anger and the author of a plan to replace Christians with Muslims in Europe. Smolensk, air crash of 10th April 2010 in Poland, which is now largely blamed on Russians and Tusk without any evidence whatsoever. And perhaps less known so-called love jihad, which is Modi's discovery that Muslims in India have this secret plan to seduce and then marry Hindu women so that to increase the Muslim population in India. And I have a little section there also on the use of lies by populists. But here I would like simply to refer to a terrific subchapter on lies in famous book by Steve Holmes and Ivan Krastev, where they just show, and I fully agree with them, that when populist authoritarians lie, they really do not mean to convince the audience to something untrue, but rather try to mobilize the people behind them and create certain, if you like, dirty community united by the common understanding of statements which are obviously untrue, but which unify them in a sort of perverse way. Let me also run very quickly through this point, and that is my chapter on COVID, because probably it deserves a separate presentation. The main point which I want to say is that obviously COVID, the pandemic, has been a very important reality check for all political systems in the world, and some sort of special leadership test. And the question from the point of view of impact of the pandemic is to what extent various fears that we liberal Democrats could have had at the outset, that it will be a great boost to authoritarians, including to populist authoritarians, in a way in which every war is a boost to authoritarians, right? Because it privileges quick and effective decision, mobilization of the electorate, etc., as opposed to the traditional liberal slow approaches. To what extent these fears were verified, and I think they weren't. So what I offer in my chapter on COVID is, and that is of course, as the cliche goes, the jury is still out. Or yet another horrible cliche, only time will tell. You know, we are in the middle still of the crisis. But so far, I do not think that this pessimistic proposition has been made true, just to the contrary. So what I'm trying to propose is not a strong thesis, although deep down I believe in it. The democracies, liberal democracies, have shown their advantages in responding to COVID, and that they have fared better in responding to the crisis. But what I'm offering is a weak thesis. That is that populist authoritarians have not shown any particular authoritarian dividend in dealing with COVID. And in the last big bullet point in this slide, I suggest at least 5 reasons for it. This has to do with the anti-scientific and anti-expert approach of populists. Think of President Trump vis-a-vis Dr. Fauci. About higher transparency, which is absolutely necessary for identifying and diagnosing the disaster. Think about the first months in China of the pandemic. About decentralization, because that's where the action is actually in dealing by the community dealings with the COVID. About degree of social and institutional trust, which for instance makes people happy to collaborate and also to undergo vaccinations. And finally, the fact that while populists are almost by their DNA much more autarkic, nationalistic, and unwilling to collaborate internationally, there is a certain paradox of the pandemic that on the one hand, it seems to require closures of countries, closures of cities, closures of apartments, but on the other hand, it is a par excellence supranational phenomenon and cannot be tackled successfully in one country only. So I discuss in my book a little bit approaches by WHO and also European Union towards the crisis. And let me just spend the last 3 to 5 minutes on the last point. So what is the way out? Is it likely that, as some people think and hope, that authoritarian populists will self-destruct, that they have certain gene of self-destruction because of their fundamental inefficiency? Or do they demonstrate certain power of endurance? My suggestion is that even despite electoral deformations in some of these countries, mainly in Hungary, to a much lesser extent in Poland, also in Brazil, the only viable way for removing populists is by electoral means. I do not see, not for some normative reasons, but as an empirical fact, I do not see much room for the revolution of people's power or mass violence, which will lead to overthrow of populists. And therefore, if that's the case, then there are certain aspects of strategy that democratic opposition must think about, which consist of these 3 main points. High turnout. Now, there is some argument that higher the turnout, the more support for Democrats, although here in political science, the evidence is not absolutely 100% convincing, but there is some argument for it. Mainly the unity of the opposition and providing a convincing program. There are some other aspects which may be, I'll come back to the program in the last sentence of my statement. There are some additional thoughts which might be thought about strategies. We may need to think about whether we should choose depolarizing strategies on the basis that polarization necessarily favors populists, or to the contrary, some delegitimizing strategies of cordon sanitaire, which seem to be the opposite way, because they do actually further polarize, sort of delegitimize populists even when they are in power. Militant democracy obviously is useless when they are in power. Another strategy would be to try to remove some of their attractiveness by absorbing their program to some extent, which is like Mark Rutte in the Netherlands avenue. But then some people may justifiably think, wouldn't the medicine there be worse than the disease? And of course, when I talk about the elections, I do not think the elections are only about the elections. They are about everything that leads to it, and that must involve a high-level social mobilization of NGOs through of Democrats through bolstering liberal and democratic NGOs, through media, through social media, which I discuss elsewhere in my book, and yes, mass demonstrations, protests, rallies, etc. But the most important thing, and this is my last thought for this presentation, is that we liberal Democrats, in thinking about the program which will be attractive enough for the population to vote the populists out of office, we must very seriously take into account the reasons which made many people to vote for populists. In other words, we must think about providing supply to the demand and about the resonance between our supply of the program to their demand. And that some of these reasons have to do with strong deficits of liberal democracy, which are not inherent to it, but which are faults of individuals. And in particular, we need to think of the values, of the sort of warm values, which can be reconciled with liberal democracy, such as community, identity, patriotism, religion, whenever it is salient in a given society. And here I really liked an article by Professor Jean Cohen of Columbia University, a professor of political philosophy, who proposed in a beautiful way a way of, at least the ways of reconciling liberalism with communitarian values. So the last point I think in my book is that while we have absolutely no reason to respect people like Orban or Le Pen or Salvini, we have no reason and no right to disrespect those who voted for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very insightful talk. And now let's collect some questions from the audience. Why don't we collect some 3, 4, and then you do a round of unsocialized questions.
Sure.
So please, anyone, please raise your digital hand, or actually a physical hand, I can see it. Yes, we have one question from Julia. Please, if you can speak up.
Thank you, Armin, and thank you very much, Professor Sardusky, for this presentation. It was excellent, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have, I guess, one comment and a question. So the comment is that I found very interesting your analysis of the role of authoritarian states in the pandemic and the tension that exists really between closure and cooperation, and how authoritarian states fail on the second aspect, so cooperation. So I thought that this was very well put. So thank you for sharing this. My question is about judges, and therefore how judges can share, can express their perspective on authoritarianism and therefore exercise their freedom of expression. There's a lot of discussion happening, I would say, also more generally in Europe as to how this freedom can be exercised, and in a way also reconciled with, in a way, impartiality and judicial independence? Because, of course, depending on the context, these different, so to say, rights, these different freedoms can lead in a way to different results. And I'm thinking, for example, about the United States, where instead we have a very different situation, a very different context. So my question is, do you think there is one formula that fits all, basically, a solution to reconcile these different elements? Or do you think instead that in order to resolve these tensions, we should have a more contextual approach? Thank you very much.
Anyone else, please, at this stage? Yes, Giuseppe, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks indeed for this talk. I think it was inspiring, and I took many notes. But I would like to ask a question about the role of the constituent power in the narrative or in the constitutional counter-narrative advanced by populists. Because in my view, I mean, they use the constituent power to attack the constitutional supremacy. And in this way, the constituent power becomes a sort of vehicle of a legal resentment. At the same time, however, and this can be found in the Hungarian example, also in the narrative supported by Trump, they frequently rely on conservative arguments. So my question is, how can we reconcile the use of the constituent power, which is a revolutionary, I mean, doctrine in a way, with this use of the conservative argument? Because in theory, I mean, they're incompatible. I would be very interested in knowing your opinion about that. Thank you very much.
I think, Professor Sadurski, these are quite substantive questions, so
Yeah.
maybe you can go ahead
Absolutely.
and answering this, and then we'll collect some more later.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you very much. So to Dr. Gentile, thank you very much, Julia, for your comment and also for your question. As to the comment, yes, I wish I could say a little bit more about this sort of inherent paradox and the situation that the pandemic at the same time triggers closures and triggers higher collaboration. And when you come to think of it seriously, it's not really a big paradox. Certainly, it's not a contradiction. There needs at the beginning to be a degree of closure just to contain the movement, to contain mobility of population, to try somehow to contain the spread of the virus. But on the other hand, no national solution, sort of self-contained, can be ever practical. And of course, Italy is one of the countries which can say a lot about it. You know, about the cost of the sort of this, what some people called vaccines nationalism at the beginning of the outburst of the pandemic. So, in a sense, since liberal democracies are more open to supranationalism, to globalization, to international collaboration, I think that at the end, in the long term, in the medium to long term, not in the short term, they have an edge over countries which are more autarkic, so to speak. Of course, there are exceptions. I mean, look at New Zealand and Australia. These were two countries which became completely isolated from the world for a very, very long time. But arguably, for many reasons, they are not good examples. For one thing, these are two societies which are very democratic, which have very high degree of social trust, which are quite decentralized, where expert opinions matter a lot, and which, most importantly, are islands. You know, so you can isolate them. You can't isolate countries which are on the European or South American or African continent. But let me move to your question, and the question is about the right of freedom of expression of judges. And this is a question which is posed with great dramatism in today's Poland, where a group of judges is extremely vocal in criticizing the so-called reform of the judiciary and of the judicial system. And the reforms, what is a reform is, of course, in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, they are being presented as reforms and seen by the proponents of the government as reforms, and they are, but by the opponents, they are seen as deformation, and not just a minor deformation, where reasonable people can disagree about what organization of courts is slightly better or slightly worse, but very fundamental, going to the essence of judicial independence. So there is a group of judges, and there are two important associations of judges, one called Justitia and another Themis, which are openly and explicitly very, very critical of government reforms. Now, there is a question of how can this type of involvement be reconciled with the principles of judicial impartiality and the principle of depoliticized judiciary. And I agree with the suggestion you made in your very question. That is, that there is no one formula which fits all countries, and that it is a very, very contextual issue. And the main aspect of the context, which is relevant here, is to what extent a reasonable person may believe that the policies of the government are not merely unwise or bad. Here, judges should not pronounce publicly, but that they actually assault and destroy the very essence of the judicial function, which is judicial independence. If, for example, a judge has different views about abortion than the majority has, then I suppose judge probably should restrain herself or himself to using their views in the judgments rather than going around media and criticize the government. But if the judge seriously believes, and if that's not a frivolous sort of idea or reflection, but if a judge seriously believes that the government policies and the new laws proposed will undermine her or his function as an independent judge, well, I think they have to. They have to protest because that's their function. Their function is to dispense justice in an independent way. And if they can't do it, then, one can say they can resign, but it will not help a systemic problem because the new judges who will come into their place will still be in the same institutional position of destroyed judicial independence. So they have to fight for it. A little bit like, I don't know, fire brigade members have to fight the regulations which increase the risk of fire. So that's and by the way, there was a very, very important judgment of European Court of Human Rights last week, which you probably know, Jurek versus Poland, in which the court decided the case for one of those most prominent judges, ruled in favor of Judge Jurek, who, among other things, was suspended, a judge from Krakow, who was suspended for being vocal against the so-called reforms. And the court said, and the claim of petitioner, of Mr. Jurek against Poland was on grounds of Article 6 and Article 10 of the convention. And the court said that he had good claim both under Article 6 and under Article 10. There was just one partly dissenting opinion by judge coming from Poland, Professor Wojtyczek, under Article 10, but in the end, although he disagreed with the argument of the court, he agreed with the conclusion that Article 10, freedom of speech, protects also judges' freedom of expression in such cases. So that's my answer to it.
Thank you very
The
much.
question about
Sorry.
the question of constituent power is difficult for me, because in these countries which I study, no explicit statements or references are made to constituent power as such, at least explicitly in, say, legal theory or legal analysis which accompany or support ruling populists. These statements figured very, very highly in the arguments of Hugo Chavez when he came to power, and where he basically dismantled all the existing institutions, and those institutions which he hadn't dismantled, he more or less left intact but powerless, and referred openly to constituent power. Even the institution which set it up was called Constitutional Convention, or Constituent Convention. And then he followed the example of a number of other Latin American countries which had similar conventions. So he relied on certain, if you like, regional tradition, I think in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in some other countries. So there, this constituent power theory was used for left-wing revolutionary purposes, such as you define, typically go hand in hand with constituent power. I'd say when you look at the only country of the currently ruling authoritarian populists which had changed the constitution, and that's Hungary, I do not know, and I'm sure that Professor Bieńka-Cała may correct me, because she's a co-author of a great recent book which looks mainly at Poland and Hungary and their legal and constitutional changes. I'm not sure that they made explicit references to constituent power. A, because it's maybe a little bit too sophisticated for the propagandist use, but B, because somehow when you refer to constituent power and institutionalize it through a constitutional convention that is some sort of super parliamentary body, a body which is specially set up for it, in a sort of like Ackermanian way, that this is the body where the sovereign actually takes up the whole power which so far has been exercised by its delegates. And somehow the procedures for preparation of Hungarian new constitution were anything but that type of exercise for constituent power. There was no special constitutional convention. There was absolutely no attempt at finding the consensus, even in a perfunctory way. The opposition was expressly removed from any works on the new constitution, and it was done very fast. I mean, it's sort of difficult to have a constitutional convention which somehow finishes its whole work in a few months. You imagine this type of deliberative process when the real will of the real people is identified and turned into the text. So they did it in an extremely pragmatic, opportunistic, disingenuous way in a matter of few months. Perhaps they could have appealed to some theories of constituent power, but I'm not aware of it. Certainly in Poland, where most of the changes of the constitution, as a matter of fact, all changes of the constitution after 2015 were operated through statutory means, that is in an unconstitutional way, no references to the constitutional power were made, other than purely propagandist language of the sovereign, which has decided to give law and justice the majority, and therefore law and justice can do whatever they want, because winner takes all. But somehow winner takes all does not amount to a good constituent power theory.
I believe I saw a hand, but I actually lost it. Can you please raise your hand? That's Agnieszka, please.
Sorry, I can't hear.
No. Oh.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Now it's better.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the presentation, Professor Sadurski. It was very interesting, and yes, thank you for that. Before I ask a question, I have some thoughts in connection to the constituent power. So I feel now that in Poland, it is constituent power, it is constitutional tribunal. Because obviously, because its competence is to check the constitutionality of legislation that change the constitution, and usually constitutional tribunal says that it is how it is understood by rulers, it is in accordance to the constitution. And well, it was discussed also like last month what is going on here in Poland, and if Constitutional Tribunal is or can do this, like say and explain what is constitutional and what is the meaning of constitution. So it was said that yes, because Constitutional Tribunal represents the people. So now we understand how is the role, or what is the role of this court. So they don't need simply constituent power if they have constitutional tribunal that is able to say what is in this illiberal constitution now. So this is my perception of the or understanding what is constituent power now in Poland. And I have one question in connection to who can change and how what we have now can be changed in Poland. And I think that it is about the people and how to mobilize people around liberal democracy and its values. What I see is the mobilization, but around illiberal values, like strong sovereign state, strong traditional family, homogeneous nation, and it is what people in Poland want. Yes, this is not like they are some like deeply liberal. I think that it is opposite, and I see here the main problem or obstacle if we consider changes. Yes, so how to attract people to these liberal values? Thank you.
Thank you.
Giacomo, please. Sorry, I was thinking about activating my microphone. Giacomo.
Thank you, Armen. I'm Giacomo Delle Donne, Assistant Professor of Constitutional Law at Scuola Sant'Anna. Thank you, Professor Sadurski, for your intriguing presentation. I was thrilled by your mentioning decentralization as one of the elements that make for the more successful response of liberal democracies to the COVID pandemic. In fact, this is a telling point. In many of our constitutional systems in Western Europe and elsewhere, there was huge debate about the merits of centralization versus decentralization. But I think the key here is the capacity of seeking cooperation, integration of central and decentralized response. And this has to do with populism, in my view. because even in our system, for instance, the Italian regional system, populism was about promoting go alone strategies at the decentralized level. And I think the key here is successful cooperation, principled cooperation, with even some room for differentiated response at all levels. So I'm curious about your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Max, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, Professor Sadurski. I hope you can hear me. And also, I just wanted to ask a short question, because I would have quite a few, but it pertains to your approach, the institutional approach, as you call it, to populism. Because I was wondering to what extent this institutional approach to populism corresponds to what in some literature currently is described more as an illiberal regime, or the discussion on illiberalism. Because there is an extensive discussion on illiberalism, and usually illiberalism is considered to be this kind of hybrid political regime between democracy and authoritarianism. But what got me particularly interested is that you describe populism as that kind of a regime. And I was wondering why you made this choice, and whether there is some kind of a relationship then between populism and illiberalism in your account. Perhaps it is because of the varieties that you highlight of populisms, but then there could be potentially varieties of illiberalisms as well. So I'd be interested in that relationship in your conception. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Sadurski, why don't you respond to these questions
Sure.
before we move ahead?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Bienkacała, for your suggestions. As to your first point, I'm not absolutely sure whether, when saying that Constitutional Tribunal is the site of constituent power in Poland, whether you meant it ironically or seriously, whether you were sarcastic or genuine. Because if we even take the Constitutional Tribunal for its word, I do not think that we'll find references, at least as a matter of institutional self-understanding, that they are constitution makers, or even that they represent, as you say, the people. Rather, they use the traditional legalistic language. Well, we are simply to explain the Constitution, but to make the Constitution is not our role. We are simply using our best legal skills to elaborate and elucidate the real meaning of the Constitution. But if the Constitution is to be changed, we defer to and actually actively encourage the Parliament to do it through constitutional revision process. So when you look, for instance, at the October 2020 anti-abortion decision of the current so-called Constitutional Tribunal, improperly constituted, then you'll see that this is purely, when you read the reasons provided by Mr. Justin Piskorski, a quasi-judge, that there is not a statement about this is what the people want. Polish people want to get rid of this genetic cause, sort of reason for abortion. Polish society wants to limit even more the access to abortion. If he said that, that would be obviously suicidal, because it's simply not true. So he's saying, well, I just, whether I like it or not, I cannot decide otherwise, because this is what the Constitution says, and this is what an earlier judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal says. So I don't see any ways of usurping the role of constitution maker. And when we look into the Constitutional Tribunal when it was a real tribunal, that is where it was not tainted by unconstitutional composition as it is now, we'll also see that there were cases when, if the Constitutional Tribunal genuinely concluded that the Constitution should be changed, or that the Constitution is imperfect, it gave the Parliament this role. That was the case of the European arrest warrant case, famous European arrest warrant case in which the judgment was written by a friend of many of us, Professor Mirosław Wyrzykowski, where they said basically, yeah, that is true. Extradition rule, explicit rule of the Constitution is inconsistent with adopting European arrest warrant. The Parliament has 18 months to decide. You can do either change the Constitution or not ratify European arrest warrant, or withdraw from the European Union, something like that, you know. So it was a clear deference to the Parliament acting as a constitutional power through the special majority to do something that the Constitutional Tribunal openly said it is powerless to do. And the Constitution acted accordingly, very quickly, very smoothly. So I really do not see, as a matter of description of what is going on, that Polish Constitutional Tribunal behaves as if it was a constituent power. But neither do I believe that as a good normative theory, it would be a good idea. I mean, obviously, the way we understand, we liberal constitutional democrats, such as you and me, understand constitutional courts, it is not that they are there to change the Constitution. That is why some constitutional theories around the world, such as the power of constitutional court to decide constitutional amendments as unconstitutional, either in a German way or in an Indian way, are so controversial. But this is not the role that Polish constitutional tribunals have ever, if I can remember well, claimed. That is to assess constitutionality of constitutional amendment. Then we could talk about some sort of skeleton constituent power of constitutional court. But it's not the case. Your second point about the majority of Polish population being illiberal, and therefore that we liberal Democrats must not, that's my already paraphrase or implication, simply appeal to people but try to change their views. I think you're right. Yes, I mean, we have a strong educational task. There is a lot of illiberalism in Poland, but I think it's often very exaggerated. I think that we meaning political theories, now I put on me a hat of a political scientist. Too often do we believe that people's views, which we then may characterize as liberal or illiberal, are somehow natural. They are there. And then the political system simply needs to adapt to them. I mean, Polish society in the beginning of 2015 was extremely, in its big majority, in favor of admitting many refugees under some conditions. Some 80% were in favor. After the double electoral campaign, and especially after the infamous words by Kaczynski about refugees bringing in all sorts of parasites, as he called it, you know, and therefore this sort of dirty, vulgar, anti-immigrant policy, only 15% were in favor. So the supply of ideological programs is something that is active and actively affects people. And people may be of two minds. Just to give you one example, there was a very famous public opinion poll discussed in Politica Weekly, conducted by a very prestigious polling institute called Kantar. When people were asked, look, after the war in Ukraine, that was the poll was in March, I think. Do you think that the government should be scrutinized with particular, I'm now paraphrasing, with particular care about what they are doing. And the second question was, do you think that the government should be, again, sort of free to conduct any actions which are necessary for defense of the country? And the answers were predominantly yes to both these questions, even though they seem to be contradictory. Much depends on how you ask the question. Much depends on the way of framing the agenda. I think if we now take one issue at a time, then we may say that you may elicit much more liberal approaches to the issues such as gay marriage, LGBT rights, abortion, and many other issues which typically produce cleavage, in terms of liberalism and illiberalism, then this general resignation, oh well, this is a liberal society, and we liberals will be always in the minority. I'm much more optimistic than that. Not that I attribute to it. I don't want to be unfair. You didn't say that, but I could hear that type of, if you like, regret that this is a largely illiberal society. I think it's much more liberal than we often believe. To Professor Delle Donne, yes, decentralization is a very crucial part of success in facing crises such as COVID. And of course, just as you had, I think, hinted, and it is not a one-way street. Obviously, there are many functions which have to be done by central government. You know, if there is a certain quota of vaccines available for the entire nation, someone has to decide about how to divide these on a day-to-day basis, how to allocate those vaccines between different regions, etc. So I think that the key is to find some degree of balance, coordination between central, regional, and local authorities. The problem is that in the conventional view, crises such as pandemic and war are normally placed at the same level of this extraordinary, dramatic, and unpredictable events where you need just unified central power. That is simply not true. We could see around the world lots of examples in which excessive centralization actually hindered anti-pandemic actions. If in China the situation wasn't such that the authorities in Wuhan had to wait for Beijing to decide what to do, and they had to wait for about a month because they were afraid of doing anything on their own, because they know that President Xi goes after anyone who questions or challenges his power, then probably the crisis would have been much lesser. There were some absolutely almost stupid examples of central power claimed by Duterte, who informed mayors of local cities in the Philippines about the local transport to transport the sick quickly to the hospital, as if he knew better in Manila what is required in Pasig City. And many Hungarian mayors complained that the pandemic was a very immediate pretext for the government to deplete them of their finances under the pretext that this money is needed for the national effort. So I think we need to look at the decentralization much more favorably than the conventional opinion has it. And finally, to Max Steuer. So look, you asked about illiberalism and why I'm talking about populism rather than illiberalism. Of course, in many ways, populism is illiberal. I mean, in a way, I define my authoritarian populism in many ways in which it's illiberal. For example, because of its clash with the principle of separation of power, which is important for liberal democracy. But the countries which I describe, and which are, I mean, whatever label we give is relatively unimportant. What is important is that we identify certain important regimes which are here to stay and which became more prevalent, which may become more prevalent, and which are cause for concern. And I think that what is most characteristic about these countries, which I define, is that they combine authoritarianism with populism. Now, authoritarianism, we know what it's about, but populism has certain features that illiberalism does not capture. For example, that the governments want to be liked. Illiberal, the government does not have to be liked. Illiberal governments of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore didn't particularly care about whether it's liked by the population or not. It cared about being complied with. But these governments want to be. Why do they want to be liked? Well, because they derive their legitimacy and intend to keep on deriving their legitimacy from electoral verdict. And they think about the next election. Even if they undermine fairness of elections, still there will be free election, and they think about it. Illiberal government does not have to. It's not part of the definition of illiberal government that they have to worry about the election. Perhaps the most paradigmatically illiberal, there can be different illiberal governments. Let me take it away. There may be different illiberal governments, but illiberals do not necessarily think about the election which structures their thinking. Now, elections try structure thinking of Orban and Kaczynski and Bolsonaro every day, morning, afternoon, and evening, because they think about various ways. And there are many things in their policy, say in their social policy, in their propaganda, in their law, which can be explained by this attempt to please the majority. Okay, so, and illiberals don't have to. And finally, those populist governments which I discuss here are not necessarily illiberal in the most fundamental sense of illiberalism, that is, that they massively violate individual rights. Illiberalism is defined by violation of individual rights or non-recognition of individual rights. That's what's illiberal about them. You know, illiberal government may be democratic because it has support of the population, but it does not respect the right to free religion, free assembly, free speech, whatever, you know, freedom of political party. But populist governments are not like this. They do respect these rights. Obviously, occasionally, they breach some of them. Right to free assembly if the rally seems to go too far. But when you look at countries such as Poland and Hungary, okay, Hungary is a special case because of the media, but take Poland. Even I, who am really probably one of the most radical critics of that government, I had to give them. They do not violate many liberal rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press is okay. Okay, some people are prosecuted, including myself, but it also happens in other democratic countries. And what are the boundaries of the law of defamation is a matter on which reasonable people will disagree. Freedom of political parties. Opposition parties operate very well in Poland. Freedom of assembly. Well, you can have anti-government rallies. Okay, the police will come and do some nasty things for you, but so will it do in Spain and France, right? So no, populist governments are not illiberal in that sense.
If I may abuse my right of a chair and ask a question myself, actually, this might be somewhat relevant to what you were just discussing, answering to the last question. And when I was following your categorization, or actually your characterization of the features of a populist regime, which was very interesting. It reminded me very much of what Umberto Eco would assign. Very many of these features would be assigned by Umberto Eco to fascism, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another political regime type that can come to the playground. And I wonder if this is the case, then what is the fine line, or what is the point that may push these populist regimes further to the right?
Yeah.
And then another question.
So, yeah, sorry, go on.
Another maybe much easier question is about because you have this very particular vision of the regime typology in relation to populism, as you characterize your. It basically it's its own. It is an own regime type, as you characterize it. Where do you place countries which really meet this criteria that you described, but not only they are not part of your analysis, but I don't see them being very often being described as populist at all, such as Serbia with Vučić. And where do you put exactly Erdogan and Turkey in their modern incarnation?
Yeah.
And let's
So
see
let me,
yeah.
Go on. No, sorry. Please
I
go
just
on.
want to see if there is any other question in the audience, or otherwise I can ask you to answer that single question at the end. Probably not at this moment. So, Professor, please go ahead.
Sure. So in some newspaper op-eds, I have written about fascism in Poland, but I made it, and I think that you are absolutely right, that many of the indices of fascism listed in the famous essay by Umberto Eco can be well recognized in a number of fascist leaders. Certainly in the case of Orban, certainly in the case of Bolsonaro, certainly Modi, Duterte, Donald Trump, and others. But I would distinguish between, and to some extent in Poland, and these are usually a degree of irrationalism, macho type of approach, anti-enlightenment, the cult of force, the cult of even violence, and so on. But I would distinguish between fascism as an ideology and fascism as an institutional practice. And that's a very important distinction. So I think that there are traces of fascism as ideology in all the states I mentioned. Moreover, since there are traces of fascism as ideology everywhere in the world, nevertheless, in these countries, this ideology often has an authoritative support of the government. For example, through state-dispensed funds to quasi-fascist organizations, as is the case in Poland. So it's not just, well, there are always some fascists somewhere at the fringes. But here fascists are being actively, sometimes supported, sometimes endorsed, sometimes praised by the government, which becomes, which makes us nervous. But there are no fascist practices. Fascism has not percolated into the institutional structure, which, again, I'm not an expert in fascism, but I would say requires institutional violence by state. That's my shortest description of institutional fascism. Institutional violence by the state or by its agents. And it doesn't exist. So it would be a huge exaggeration to call countries such as Poland, Hungary, or the Philippines fascist or even quasi-fascist. But it will be certainly true that aspects of fascism are present in the ideologies and the rhetoric of the leaders. I mean, take ex-President Duterte, who boasted how many drug peddlers he killed, actually.
Himself.
What is it if not fascism? Yeah, killed himself, yeah. So, so that's my answer about fascism. How about other countries? Here I'm treading on very thin ice, because what I'm making at the beginning of my book, I am making a general caveat that my list of those exemplars, which I list, which again are Poland, Hungary, India, the Philippines, and Brazil, and Venezuela historically, is non-exhaustive. Obviously, there are many other countries in the world which may fit that picture. And, you know, I simply don't know them. And it's not my, in a sense, ambition to provide an exhaustive and comprehensive analysis of authoritarian populism in the world. But some of the, so, you know, we may discuss many other countries. We may perhaps discuss Argentina, and we can discuss South Africa, and so on. But of the two countries which you mentioned, it seems to me that probably Serbia is closer to the liberal democratic, today's Serbia, to the liberal democratic model than for example, Poland and Hungary are now, which are sort of like paradigmatic for me. At least, you know, I'm biased here. I had in the State of the Union conference in Florence last month, current Prime Minister of Serbia, and she sounded to me very much like a liberal democratic leader, perhaps because she desperately wants to get Serbia into the EU ASAP. So they are on their best behavior. You know, that's what happens to all the candidate states. I don't know. I'm not an expert. Turkey, on the other hand, seems to be the opposite picture. This seems to me to be country much more in the fully fledged authoritarian group than being this hybrid populist authoritarian. I mean, populist authoritarian states normally do not have public prisoners, not too many at least. You know, they don't have full-scale oppression and repression and violence of the state against its opponents. Normally, you know, you can be a university lecturer and a judge, although with judges the situation is more precarious, and a writer, and not have any particular repression in countries like Brazil or India, and be very critical of the government. In Turkey, not. Neither in Russia, nor in Belarus. So these countries, for me, they have crossed already the boundary between what may be seen as this type of hybrid and move to the more authoritarian system. Also because the elections are increasingly sham. I mean, I still maintain that free and by and large fair elections is a defining feature for a populist authoritarian state. But you don't have that in Turkey, I think, now. I don't know. I mean, then remembering about the election of the mayor of Istanbul, you may think differently. So this is always a matter of degree. I mean, there are no clear-cut black and white distinctions here, like in any hybrid.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if there is any one last question. And if not, I should thank you very much for this opportunity for us to be the first audience to listen about your new book, and again, to congratulate you on this book. Wish you all the best and good luck with, I know you will go through a series of presentations, a world tour of presentations of the new book. Good luck with it, and all the best to everyone who joined us today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.